I stood in the marble entryway of the Blackwood mansion, watching my family argue over seating arrangements for Christmas dinner. The crystal chandelier cast sharp shadows across their faces as they debated whether the mahogany dining table could accommodate everyone. My stepmother Patricia held a clipboard, her manicured fingers tapping against it with the precision of a military strategist. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, 34 years old, the sole heir to a pharmaceutical fortune worth $200 million, and they were discussing where to put me like I was an inconvenient piece of furniture. "Evelyn can sit with the children," Patricia announced, not even looking in my direction. "The folding table by the window should work perfectly." My half-brother Marcus smirked from his position by the fireplace, swirling his bourbon like he owned the place, which, according to everyone in this room, he practically did. "Makes sense," he said. "She's never really grown up anyway." The Blackwood family Christmas had always been a performance, but this year felt different. More calculated. More cruel. I adjusted the sleeve of my simple black dress, a stark contrast to the designer gowns floating around me like expensive ghosts. Every woman in this room wore jewelry that cost more than most people's cars. Except for me. I'd stopped trying to compete years ago. "The children's table will be lovely," I said quietly, my voice cutting through their chatter. "I'm sure little Emma and James will enjoy the company." Patricia's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Oh, Evelyn, always so gracious about everything." She turned to address the room like I wasn't standing right there. "It's remarkable how some people never quite learn to assert themselves, isn't it?" My cousin Diana nodded enthusiastically, her pearl earrings catching the light. "Some people are just naturally submissive. It's probably genetic." She glanced meaningfully at the oil portrait of my mother hanging above the mantelpiece. "Even in death." My mother was being used as ammunition. I remembered a different Christmas 15 years ago, when my mother was still alive and this house felt like home instead of a mausoleum. She'd worn a red velvet dress and danced with my father in the living room, while Bing Crosby played on the old record player. The tree had been smaller then, more intimate, decorated with handmade ornaments I'd crafted in elementary school art class. My father had died when I was 19, leaving everything to my mother, with the understanding that it would eventually come to me. But my mother, in her grief and loneliness, had remarried within 2 years. Patricia arrived like a hurricane wrapped in Chanel, bringing Marcus and a whole new set of priorities. "Evelyn, darling," Patricia called out now, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Could you help Maria in the kitchen? I think she's struggling with the appetizer presentation." It wasn't a request. It never was. I nodded and walked toward the kitchen, my heels clicking against the marble with hollow echoes. Behind me, I heard Marcus laugh and say something about knowing your place in the family hierarchy. The kitchen was my refuge. Maria, our longtime housekeeper, looked up from arranging shrimp on silver platters. Her weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her eyes were sad. She'd been with our family since before my father died, and she'd watched the slow transformation of this house from a home into something else entirely. "Miss Evelyn," she said softly in her accented English, "you don't need to help. I have everything under control." "I know," I replied, picking up a tea towel, "but I'd rather be here than out there." She studied my face with the concern of someone who'd known me since childhood. "Your mother, she would not like how they treat you." My mother. Elizabeth Blackwood had been a force of nature disguised as a society wife. She'd inherited the pharmaceutical company from her father and had the business sense to multiply its value tenfold before passing it on. But she'd also been naive about people, trusting in a way that ultimately cost her everything. "My mother made her choices," I said, arranging parsley around the shrimp, "and now I have to live with them." The truth was more complicated. When my mother married Patricia's father, she'd been so desperately lonely that she'd convinced herself she was gaining a family. Patricia, then 28 and recently divorced, had played the role of grateful stepdaughter perfectly. Marcus, just 16, had been quiet and seemingly harmless. But money changes people. Or maybe it just reveals who they really were all along. The dinner bell chimed, and I dried my hands, preparing to join the family theater. When I entered the dining room, the scene was exactly as I'd expected. The main table gleamed with china and crystal, surrounded by the adults in their holiday finery. In the corner, a small folding table was set for 3, with paper napkins and plastic cups. My 7-year-old nephew James was already seated there, swinging his legs and looking confused. "Aunt Evelyn, why aren't you sitting with the grown-ups?" His innocence cut deeper than any of Patricia's calculated cruelties. "Because sometimes," I said, settling into the tiny chair, "the kids' table is the most fun place to be." Emma, my 9-year-old niece, looked at me with the sharp intelligence that reminded me of myself at that age. "But you're not a kid," she said matter-of-factly. "You're older than my dad." From the main table, Marcus called out, "Emma, don't question the seating arrangements. Some people prefer simpler accommodations." I watched him cut into his prime rib with theatrical precision, playing the patriarch role he'd never earned. Patricia sat beside him like a queen surveying her kingdom, occasionally leaning over to whisper something that made him chuckle. My other relatives filled the remaining seats, each one complicit in this elaborate humiliation. "Tell us about your work, Evelyn," called out my Uncle Robert, Patricia's brother who'd mysteriously appeared in our lives around the same time as his sister. "Still doing that charity thing?" The charity thing. For the past decade, I'd been running a foundation that provided medical supplies to underserved communities. It was meaningful work that my mother had supported before her remarriage shifted her priorities. But to this family, it was just another sign of my fundamental unseriousness about real wealth. "The foundation is doing well," I replied, cutting Emma's turkey into smaller pieces. "We've opened 3 new clinics this year." "How wonderfully altruistic," Patricia said, her tone suggesting it was anything but wonderful. Though I do worry about the sustainability of such ventures, especially when they're funded by, shall we say, limited resources. Limited resources. She was referring to my trust fund, which provided me with a comfortable but not extravagant living. What she didn't know was that the bulk of my mother's estate remained untouched, managed by a firm that sent me quarterly reports I never opened. "Some things are more important than money," I said quietly. The table erupted in gentle laughter, as if I'd told an amusing joke. Marcus raised his glass in a mock toast. "To idealism," he said. "May it always find a comfortable corner to flourish in." I thought about my mother's will, locked away in the family attorney's office. I'd never read it, never wanted to confront the reality of how she'd chosen to divide her legacy. But lately, I'd been wondering. Patricia's confidence suggested she knew something I didn't. After dinner, the family gathered in the living room for gift exchange. This was always the most painful part of the evening, watching expensive presents change hands while I sat in the corner with my token gift of a book or scarf. This year, Patricia presented Marcus with a vintage Rolex that had belonged to my father. "I thought it was time this found its proper home," she said, fastening it around his wrist. My father's watch. I remembered him checking it during our
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
bedtime story rituals, promising he had time for one more chapter. The memory hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. I'd learned years ago that showing pain only invited more. The evening dragged on with the usual performances. Uncle Robert told the same stories about his golf game. Diana complained about her decorator. Marcus pontificated about market trends, while Patricia nodded approvingly. I sat in my designated chair, present but invisible, part of the furniture. Finally, people began to leave. Coats were retrieved, air kisses exchanged, promises made about lunch dates that would never happen. I helped Maria clear the dishes, grateful for something to do with my hands. "You should go home," Maria said as we loaded the dishwasher. "This is not good for you. Home." The small apartment I rented across town suddenly seemed like paradise compared to this mausoleum. But something was holding me here tonight, some instinct I couldn't name. As I gathered my purse and coat, Patricia cornered me in the hallway. Her smile was sharp and predatory, the mask finally slipping. "Evelyn, dear," she said, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "I hope you're not still harboring any illusions about your future with this family." I looked at her. This woman who'd married into our lives and systematically dismantled everything my mother had built. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Of course you do." She stepped closer, and I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with wine. "Your mother was very clear about her intentions in her final years. She wanted to ensure the family legacy went to someone who could handle it properly." The implication hung in the air between us like poison gas. I thought about my mother's last months, how confused she'd become, how isolated from everyone except Patricia and her inner circle. "I see," I said finally. "I'm sure you do." Patricia's smile widened. "It's probably best if you start making your own way in the world, without expectations." I drove home through empty streets, past houses glowing with warm Christmas lights. Other families were probably finishing their own celebrations. Children asleep with sugar cookie dreams. Parents collapsing onto sofas with satisfied exhaustion. Normal families who treated each other with basic decency. My apartment felt cold and hollow after the grandeur of the mansion. But it was mine. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by my small tree, thinking about my mother's final years. The confusion, the way she'd seemed to drift away from me, the sudden changes in her routine and relationships. I'd attributed it to grief and age, but tonight's conversation with Patricia painted a different picture. A more calculated one. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Miss Blackwood, this is Harold Pemberton, from Pemberton Walsh and Associates. Your mother's attorneys. I need to schedule a meeting with you at your earliest convenience. There are matters regarding your mother's estate that require immediate attention." I stared at the message, my heart hammering against my ribs. My mother had been dead for 18 months. What could possibly require immediate attention after all this time? I texted back quickly. "Is everything all right? Has something happened?" His response came within minutes. "Nothing is wrong, but there are developments you need to be aware of. Can you come in tomorrow? This matter cannot wait." Tomorrow was December 26th. What kind of legal matter couldn't wait until after the holidays? I agreed to meet him at 10 in the morning, then spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling and wondering what new disaster was about to unfold. The law office was in the financial district, all glass and steel and intimidation. Harold Pemberton turned out to be a distinguished man in his 60s, with the kind of gravitas that came from handling wealthy family secrets for decades. His office walls were lined with law books and photographs of him, with various politicians and celebrities. "Miss Blackwood," he said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his massive desk. "Thank you for coming on. Such short notice." "You said it was urgent." He nodded, opening a thick folder. "Your mother's will contains several provisions that have time-sensitive components. Specifically, there's a clause that activates 18 months after her death." 18 months. Yesterday. "What kind of clause?" He leaned back in his chair, studying me with sharp eyes. "Your mother was concerned about your well-being in the years before her death. She came to believe that certain family members might attempt to marginalize you or manipulate your inheritance." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are you saying?" "She created what we call a revelatory clause. If, after 18 months, you hadn't come forward to claim your full inheritance, or if you appeared to be unaware of its extent, I was instructed to contact you directly." "I don't understand." "I have my trust fund." Harold's expression was grave. "Miss Blackwood, the trust fund represents approximately 2% of your mother's total estate. You are the sole heir to everything else. The pharmaceutical company, the real estate holdings, the investment portfolios, everything." The words hit me like a truck. "That's impossible." Patricia said, "Mrs. Patricia Blackwood has no claim to your mother's estate whatsoever. Neither does her son Marcus or any of her relatives." He slid a document across the desk. "This is a copy of your mother's will, executed 6 months before her death. She was very specific about her wishes." I stared at the pages, the legal language swimming before my eyes. But certain phrases stood out with crystal clarity. "To my beloved daughter Evelyn, who has shown unwavering compassion and integrity." The entirety of my estate, including all business interests, properties, and investments. Should Evelyn appear to be unaware of her inheritance due to outside interference? How much? I whispered. Current valuation is approximately $480 million. The room spun around me. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to process what I was hearing. But Patricia, she's been living in the house. Marcus has been making business decisions. They told me my mother changed her mind about everything. They lied. Harold's voice was flat and matter-of-fact. Your mother suspected they would. That's why she created multiple safeguards. The house, the company, all of it legally belongs to you. They've been operating under fraudulent assumptions. I thought about Christmas dinner, about the kids' table, about Patricia's smug confidence, about my father's watch on Marcus's wrist, and the casual cruelty of the past 18 months. What happens now? Harold smiled for the first time since I'd entered his office. Now, Miss Blackwood, you decide what kind of justice you want to pursue. Justice. The word tasted foreign on my tongue. For so long, I'd accepted my role as the forgotten daughter, the charity case, the family disappointment. But sitting in that leather chair, holding legal proof of my mother's true intentions, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Power. I want to understand everything, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Every asset, every account, every property. I want to know exactly what they've stolen from me. That will take some time to compile, but I can give you the basics now. Harold opened another folder. The pharmaceutical company generates approximately $50 million in annual profit. The real estate portfolio includes the family mansion, 2 vacation homes, and 17 commercial properties. The investment accounts have performed exceptionally well over the past 18 months. $50 million. I thought about my modest apartment, my second-hand car, the way I'd carefully budgeted every expense while Patricia lived like a queen in my mother's house. There's something else, Harold continued. Your mother included specific instructions about how this information should be revealed to the family. She anticipated that they might react poorly to the truth. What did she suggest? He pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written in my mother's familiar handwriting. She wrote this for you to read after our meeting. But Miss Blackwood, I should warn you, your mother was very angry when she drafted this will. Some of her suggestions are quite comprehensive. I took the envelope, my hands trembling slightly. Can I read this now? Of course. Take all the time you need. I opened the envelope carefully, as if it might contain something explosive. In a way, it did. My dearest Evelyn, the letter began, in my mother's elegant script. If you are reading this, then my worst fears about Patricia and her family have come true. I hope you can forgive an old woman's paranoia, but I began to suspect in my final months that they were manipulating me, isolating me from you, and planning to steal your inheritance. I could hear my mother's voice in every word, the mixture of love and fury that had defined her personality. By now, Harold has explained your true position. You are not the forgotten daughter. You are not the charity case they've made you believe yourself to be. You are one of the wealthiest women in the state, and you have been since the day I died. My hands shook as I turned the page. What they have done to you is unforgivable. The humiliation, the exclusion, the systematic campaign to make you feel worthless. I watched it begin before I died, and I hated myself for being too weak to stop it. But death, my darling, has given me a different kind of strength. The letter went on to detail specific suggestions for reclaiming my inheritance and dealing with the family. Some of her ideas were mild, like simply evicting them from the house. Others were more creative, involving public humiliation and financial ruin. Remember, the letter concluded, mercy is a luxury you can afford to give or withhold. They showed you none when they thought you were powerless. Consider that when deciding their fate. I folded the letter carefully and looked up at Harold. How long do I have to decide what to do? There's no time limit on claiming your inheritance. But there are practical considerations. The longer they remain in positions they have no right to hold, the more complicated the unwinding becomes. I thought about Marcus wearing my father's watch, about Patricia's smug certainty that she'd won, about 18 months of believing I was nothing more than a disappointing burden on a family that barely tolerated me. I need a few days to think, I said finally. Of course, but Miss Blackwood. Harold's expression was serious. Be careful who you trust with this information. Your mother was right to be paranoid. I drove home in a daze, my mother's letter burning like a secret fire in my purse. The city looked different now that I knew the truth. Buildings that had seemed impressive yesterday now looked like potential acquisitions. People walking past my car weren't just strangers. They were employees of companies I apparently owned. $480 million. I parked outside my apartment building and sat in my car for a long time, watching my neighbors go about their ordinary lives. Mrs. Chen from 3B struggled with her groceries. The college kids next door played music too loud. Normal problems. Problems I'd thought were mine just this morning. My phone rang. Marcus. Evelyn. His voice was warm and friendly, as if yesterday's humiliation had never happened. I hope you had a good evening after dinner. Patricia and I were just discussing some family business, and we thought you might like to be included. The audacity was breathtaking. Less than 24 hours after relegating me to the children's table, he was calling to discuss family business. What kind of business? I asked, curious to see how far this performance would go. Well, we've been thinking about expanding the foundation's scope, maybe involving some of the family's other interests. Patricia has some wonderful ideas about efficiency and cost management. Efficiency and cost management. They wanted to gut my foundation and absorb its assets. The foundation my mother had supported, that served communities they'd never even heard of. That sounds interesting, I said, keeping my voice neutral. When did you want to discuss this? How about lunch tomorrow? The club at noon? The club. Where they could continue treating me like a petitioner rather than the owner of everything they thought they controlled. I'll be there, I said. After hanging up, I sat in my car and felt something I'd never experienced before. Not anger, exactly, not even hatred. It was something colder and more focused. It was the feeling of a chess player who just realized their opponent had been playing checkers. That night, I made a list. Not of what I wanted to do to them, but of what they'd done to me. 18 months of systematic humiliation. Theft of my inheritance. Fraud. Manipulation of my dying mother. The list was longer than I'd expected. I also made another list. Every charity they'd always claimed to support but never actually helped. Every cause they'd spoken about passionately at dinner parties but never funded. Every person they'd looked down on while living off money that belonged to me. By morning, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The country club was exactly what you'd expect. All mahogany and crystal and quiet money. Patricia and Marcus were already seated at their usual table, the one with the best view of the golf course. They dressed for the occasion, probably planning to make some dramatic presentation about the future of our family foundation. I arrived deliberately late, wearing the same simple black dress I'd worn to Christmas dinner. Let them think I was still the poor relation. Let them believe they were still in control. "Yoan, darling," Patricia stood to air-kiss my cheek. "You look lovely." "Doesn't she look lovely, Marcus?" Marcus nodded approvingly, as if my appearance was something that required his validation. "Very nice." "I was just telling Mother Patricia that we should probably update your wardrobe budget. Something more in line with your new responsibilities." New responsibilities? They'd already decided how to restructure my life. "What new responsibilities?" I asked, settling into my chair. "Well," Patricia leaned forward conspiratorially, "we've been thinking about your foundation. It's wonderful work, of course, but it could be so much more impactful with proper management and oversight." "Proper management meaning you?" "Meaning family oversight," Marcus corrected smoothly. "A board structure that includes people with real business experience. People who understand how to maximize philanthropic impact." I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering their proposal. "And what would my role be in this new structure?" "You'd remain as the public face, naturally," Patricia said, "the heart and soul of the organization. But the operational decisions would be handled by people with more experience in fiscal management." "Fiscal management?" They wanted to turn me into a figurehead while they looted the foundation's resources. That's very generous of you, I said, but I should probably mention something before we go any further. They looked at me expectantly, probably anticipating some grateful acceptance of their magnificent offer. I met with Harold Pemberton yesterday, my mother's attorney. The change was instant. Patricia's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. Marcus set down his water glass with careful precision. Oh? Patricia's voice was light, but her eyes had gone cold. Is there some issue with the trust fund? You could say that. I paused, enjoying the moment. It turns out there's been a misunderstanding about my mother's will. Marcus laughed, but it sounded forced. What kind of misunderstanding? The kind where you've been living in my house and spending my money for 18 months. The silence that followed was profound. Other diners continued their conversations around us, but our table had become an island of frozen shock. I'm sorry, Patricia said finally, her voice carefully controlled. I think there's been some confusion. No confusion, I replied calmly. Just fraud. But don't worry, I'm sure we can work something out. Marcus found his voice first. Evelyn, if someone has been filling your head with fantasies about Mother's estate, $480 million, I interrupted. That's the current valuation, though it's grown quite a bit since you've been managing it so well. Patricia's face had gone white beneath her perfect makeup. That's impossible. Your mother was very clear about her intentions. She wanted the family assets to remain with the family. I am the family, I said quietly. You're just people she married, or who came along with people she married. The brutality of the truth hung in the air between us. For 18 months, they'd convinced themselves they were the real family, while treating me like an inconvenient hanger-on. Now, in the span of 5 minutes, their entire reality had crumbled. There must be some mistake, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. The will we saw was apparently a fake, I finished, or maybe just wishful thinking. But the real will is quite clear. Everything goes to me. Everything. I could see them processing the implications, the house they'd been redecorating, the business decisions Marcus had been making, the lifestyle they'd been living. All of it built on a foundation of lies and theft. Well, Patricia said, her composure cracking, I'm sure we can discuss this reasonably. After all, your mother intended for the family to remain together. Did she? I asked. Because according to her letter, she was pretty angry about how you treated me. Apparently, she'd been watching the systematic humiliation campaign you two had been running. Marcus's face flushed red. That's ridiculous. We've always treated you with respect. Respect. I let the word hang in the air. Is that what you call making me sit at the children's table? Taking my father's watch? Telling people I'm not suited for adult responsibilities? You're overreacting to what was simply a seating arrangement, Patricia said. But her voice was shaking now. And yesterday's lunch invitation? The generous offer to let me be the pretty face of my own foundation while you strip it for parts? They had no answer for that. The beautiful thing about truth is that it doesn't require elaboration or justification. It simply exists, immutable and devastating. So what happens now? Marcus asked finally. I smiled, and for the first time in 18 months, it felt genuine. Now? Now you learn what it feels like to sit at the kids' table. The weeks following that lunch at the country club unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction. I watched Patricia and Marcus scramble to understand their new reality, while I methodically dismantled the lies they'd built their lives upon. My first move was subtle. I arranged to meet with Dr. Sarah Chen, the chief financial officer of Blackwood Pharmaceuticals, at a small coffee shop downtown. Sarah had worked for my mother for over a decade and had been mysteriously excluded from company decisions since Patricia's arrival in our lives. Evelyn, Sarah's face lit up when she saw me approaching her table. I was so surprised to get your call. I haven't seen you since your mother's funeral. That wasn't entirely accurate. Sarah had reached out several times in the months after my mother's death, but Patricia had somehow intercepted most communications meant for me, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. I know this might seem strange, I began, settling into the chair across from her, but I need to understand what's been happening at the company since my mother passed away. Sarah's expression grew troubled. It's been difficult, to be honest. Marcus has been making decisions that go against everything your mother built. He's been talking about restructuring, bringing in outside consultants, changing our charitable giving programs. My mother's charitable giving programs had been the heart of the company's mission. She'd believed that pharmaceutical companies had a moral obligation to ensure their medicines reached people who couldn't afford them. What kind of changes? He wants to eliminate the low-income assistance programs, says they're not financially sustainable. Sarah's voice carried the frustration of someone who'd been fighting a losing battle. He's also been pushing to sell off our research into rare diseases. Apparently, the profit margins aren't attractive enough. Rare diseases. My mother had been passionate about funding research for conditions that affected small populations, knowing that Big Pharma typically ignored them because they weren't profitable enough. It was exactly the kind of compassionate capitalism that had made her both wealthy and respected. Sarah, I said carefully, what would you say if I told you that Marcus has no legal authority to make any of these decisions? Her coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. What do you mean? I pulled out a copy of the will that Harold had given me. Marcus isn't the heir to my mother's estate. I am. He's been operating under fraudulent authority for 18 months. The transformation in Sarah's face was remarkable. Relief, anger, and something that looked like vindication all flickered across her features in rapid succession. I knew something was wrong, she whispered. Your mother would never have wanted those changes. But when I questioned them, Patricia told me that you'd agreed to let Marcus handle the business side of things since you weren't interested in corporate management. Another lie. Another way they'd systematically isolated me from my own inheritance. I need your help, I continued. I need a complete audit of everything that's happened since my mother's death. Every decision, every transaction, every change in policy. Sarah nodded emphatically. Absolutely. But Evelyn, there's something else you need to know. Marcus has been in talks with Preston Industries about a potential merger. Preston Industries, a massive conglomerate known for acquiring smaller companies and stripping them for parts. If Marcus succeeded in selling to them, my mother's life's work would be dismantled within months. How far along are these talks? Pretty far. He's scheduled a board meeting for next week to vote on the preliminary proposal. A board meeting that I, as the actual owner of the company, had never been informed about. The audacity was staggering. Can you get me copies of all the documents related to this merger proposal? Of course. But, Evelyn, the board Marcus assembled doesn't include any of your mother's original advisors. He's filled it with his own people and Patricia's relatives. An illegitimate board voting on an illegitimate merger using stolen authority. It was fraud on a breathtaking scale. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing the documents Sarah had compiled. The scope of Marcus's unauthorized decisions was overwhelming. He'd changed vendor contracts, modified employee benefit packages, and even sold off one of the company's smaller research facilities. All while I'd been sitting at children's tables and believing I was a burden on the family. My phone rang. It was Uncle Robert, Patricia's brother. Evelyn, dear. His voice was warm but carried an undertone I'd never noticed before. Patricia mentioned you had some concerns about family business matters. I thought perhaps we could chat. Robert had always positioned himself as the reasonable mediator in family disputes. The calm voice who could smooth over any disagreement with logic and charm. I'd never realized before that he was simply another player in their elaborate game. What kind of chat? I asked. Well, perhaps we could discuss your future plans. I understand you've been getting some conflicting information about your mother's estate. Conflicting information? As if the legal documents proving my inheritance were merely one opinion among many. I'd be happy to meet, I said. Where did you have in mind? How about the yacht club tomorrow evening? 7 o'clock? I think you'll find I have some perspectives that might be helpful. The yacht club, where Robert was a longtime member and I would be the outsider asking for favors. Another carefully chosen power play. I'll be there. The next evening, I arrived at the yacht club wearing my best dress, which still paled in comparison to the casual elegance of the other patrons. Robert was waiting at a table overlooking the marina, a glass of whiskey already in hand. "Evelyn?" He stood to greet me, his manner warm and paternal. "You look lovely. Can I order you something to drink?" "Just water, thank you." He settled back into his chair and studied me with the calculating gaze of a man assessing an opponent's weaknesses. "I understand you've been having some conversations with lawyers recently." "I have. And they've filled your head with some rather extraordinary claims about your inheritance." I remained silent, letting him reveal his strategy. "The thing is, Evelyn, legal documents can be interpreted in many different ways. What matters isn't just what's written on paper, but what's practical, what's feasible, what's in everyone's best interests." "Go on." "Your mother's will may technically name you as heir, but think about the reality of the situation. You have no experience running a pharmaceutical company. You've never shown interest in the business side of the family legacy. Marcus, on the other hand, has been deeply involved in operations for over a year." He paused to sip his whiskey, letting his words sink in. "More importantly, a legal challenge would be expensive, time-consuming, and destructive to the family unity your mother valued so highly. Is that really what you want? To tear apart everything she built over technicalities? Technicalities, as if legal ownership was merely a minor detail. What are you suggesting, Robert?" "I'm suggesting that we find a solution that works for everyone. Patricia and Marcus continue managing the estate and the company, where they've proven themselves capable. You receive a generous settlement that allows you to pursue your charitable interests without the burden of corporate responsibilities. Everyone wins." "A generous settlement? From my own money? How generous are we talking about?" Robert leaned forward, his expression earnest. $5 million. Plus a guaranteed annual income of $200,000 for life. You'd never have to worry about money again, and you could focus entirely on the foundation work you're passionate about. $5 million out of $480 million. Less than 2% of what was legally mine. "That's very thoughtful," I said carefully. "But I should probably consult with my attorney before making any decisions." Robert's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course. But Evelyn, I hope you'll consider the broader implications. Legal battles can get very ugly. Things might come to light that could be embarrassing for everyone involved." "What kind of things?" "Well, for instance, there are questions about your mother's mental state in her final months. The confusion, the paranoia, the way she seemed to turn against family members who'd only ever tried to help her. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. They were prepared to attack my mother's memory, to claim she'd been incompetent when she wrote her will." "I see. I'm sure you do. You're a smart woman, Evelyn. Smart enough to recognize when compromise serves everyone's interests better than conflict." I drove home that night with a newfound clarity about the enemy I was facing. This wasn't just greed or opportunism. It was a coordinated campaign designed to steal my inheritance while making me grateful for the privilege. But Robert had made a crucial mistake. He'd shown me exactly how far they were willing to go, which meant I no longer needed to hold back. The next morning, I called Harold Pemberton and scheduled an emergency meeting. When I arrived at his office, I brought copies of all the documents Sarah had provided, along with a detailed account of my conversations with Marcus, Patricia, and Robert. "This is extensive fraud," Harold said after reviewing everything. "They've been operating a criminal enterprise using stolen authority. What are my options? Legally, you have several paths. You could pursue criminal charges, civil suits, or simply assert your ownership and evict them from positions they have no right to hold. And if they try to claim my mother was incompetent when she wrote the will?" Harold smiled grimly. "Your mother anticipated that strategy. She had herself evaluated by 3 independent psychiatrists in the months before her death. All confirmed her complete mental competency. She also videotaped herself reading the entire will aloud, with timestamps and witnesses. My mother had been 3 steps ahead of them, even from her deathbed. There's something else," Harold continued. "Your mother included specific provisions for this exact scenario. If anyone attempted to usurp your inheritance through fraud or manipulation, she authorized what she called nuclear options. What kind of nuclear options? Complete financial destruction. She documented every favor she'd ever done for Patricia's family, every loan that was never repaid, every opportunity she'd created for them. If they tried to steal from you, she wanted you to have the tools to destroy them utterly. I thought about the yacht club conversation, about Robert's casual threats against my mother's memory, about Marcus wearing my father's watch while selling off pieces of my mother's legacy. Show me everything. The files Harold produced were staggering in their thoroughness. My mother had kept detailed records of Patricia and Robert's financial histories, including bankruptcies, failed businesses, and debts that had been quietly forgiven. She documented Marcus's academic failures, his drug problems in college, and the legal troubles that had been covered up with family money. My money, technically. But more than that, she'd traced the web of lies they'd constructed around my inheritance. Bank records showing Patricia had been intercepting my mail. Phone logs proving they'd been screening my calls. Even recordings of conversations where they'd explicitly discussed how to manipulate me into believing I wasn't entitled to my own legacy. Your mother was very thorough, Harold observed. She understood that people who would steal from family members were capable of anything. How do we proceed? That depends on what outcome you want. Do you want justice, revenge, or simply your property back? I considered the question. For 18 months, I'd endured their systematic cruelty while they lived off money that belonged to me. They'd stolen my inheritance, perverted my mother's legacy, and tried to make me grateful for scraps from my own table. I want them to understand what it feels like to lose everything. Harold nodded approvingly. Then we'll need to move quickly. Marcus's board meeting is in 3 days. If he succeeds in pushing through the merger with Preston Industries, unwinding it will become exponentially more complicated. We spent the next 2 hours crafting a strategy that would systematically dismantle their fraudulent empire while ensuring they faced the full consequences of their actions. It was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its scope. The plan began with a phone call to Marcus, scheduled for the morning of his board meeting. I dialed his number at exactly 8 a.m., knowing he would be preparing for what he thought would be his moment of triumph. Evelyn, his voice was distracted, probably reviewing presentation materials. This isn't a great time. Can we talk later? Actually, this can't wait. I need to inform you that your board meeting today is canceled. What are you talking about? The meeting is in 3 hours. Marcus, you don't have the authority to call board meetings for a company you don't own. There was a long pause. Evelyn, we've been through this. Whatever that lawyer told you, Harold Pemberton is here with me now. Would you like to speak with him directly? I handed the phone to Harold, who introduced himself with professional courtesy before delivering the legal facts with surgical precision. Marcus, Patricia, and Robert had been operating under fraudulent authority for 18 months. All their decisions were void. All their contracts were invalid. All their access to company resources was terminated immediately. Furthermore, Harold continued, we have documented evidence of mail, tampering, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. If you attempt to proceed with today's meeting, you will be arrested for corporate impersonation. The silence on the other end stretched for nearly a minute. Put Evelyn back on, Marcus said finally, his voice hollow. Hello, Marcus. What do you want? I want you to call every board member and cancel today's meeting. Then I want you to vacate the corporate offices and surrender all company property in your possession. And if I refuse, then by noon today you'll be arrested for fraud, and by evening the business press will have copies of all the documentation proving that you've been running a criminal enterprise using stolen authority. Another long pause. You can't be serious about this. I'm completely serious. You've had 18 months of playing house with my money. Now it's time to face reality. I could hear him breathing heavily, probably calculating his options and realizing he didn't have any good ones. How do I know you won't destroy us anyway? You don't, but I can guarantee that if you don't comply immediately, the destruction will be total and public. He hung up without another word. Within an hour, Harold received confirmation that the board meeting had been canceled and that Marcus was clearing out his office. But I knew this was just the beginning. People who had spent 18 months living off stolen money wouldn't surrender without trying every possible angle. Sure enough, my phone rang again that afternoon. This time, it was Patricia. "Evelyn?" Her voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the panic underneath. "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding, just consequences. Surely we can work this out like adults. Family should stick together." "You're not my family," I said calmly. "You're people who married into my family and then stole from me. That's not fair. Your mother welcomed us with open arms. She wanted us to be part of her legacy. My mother's legacy was supposed to be mine. You perverted it into your personal piggy bank." Patricia's composure finally cracked. "You ungrateful little bitch. Do you have any idea what we've done for you? We could have had you declared incompetent years ago. We could have had you committed. We showed you mercy, and this is how you repay us?" The mask was finally off. The warm, maternal stepmother was gone, replaced by the calculating predator who had manipulated my dying mother and stolen my inheritance. "Mercy," I repeated. "Is that what you call 18 months of humiliation and theft? You had everything you needed. A roof over your head, an allowance, meaningful work to keep you busy. We gave you a purpose. You gave me scraps from my own table and convinced me to be grateful for them. And what are you going to do now? Destroy the only family you have left? Your mother would be ashamed of you." It was exactly the wrong thing to say. The last thread of restraint I'd been holding on to snapped. "My mother left detailed instructions for exactly this scenario," I said, my voice deadly calm. "She anticipated that you would try to steal from me, and she prepared consequences." "What consequences?" "You'll find out tomorrow morning when the eviction notice arrives. You have 72 hours to vacate my house." "Your house?" "We've been living there for 18 months. On my property, with my money, wearing my father's jewelry. But that ends now." The silence that followed was profound. "Where are we supposed to go?" Patricia asked finally, her voice small. "That's not my problem. You had 18 months to save money for this possibility. What did you do with it instead?" Of course, I knew exactly what they'd done with it. They'd lived like royalty, convinced that they'd successfully stolen my inheritance permanently. They'd spent money they thought would never run out, made plans based on wealth they'd never legally possessed. "Evelyn, please. You can't just throw us out onto the street." "Can't I? You were perfectly willing to let me believe I was a charity case while you lived in luxury. Now you get to discover what actual charity feels like." I hung up and immediately called Harold to confirm that the eviction papers would be served first thing in the morning. Then I called Sarah and asked her to schedule an emergency board meeting for the end of the week, this time with my mother's original advisors, and none of the fraudulent appointees Marcus had installed. That evening I drove to the mansion for the first time since Christmas dinner. I parked in the circular driveway and sat in my car for a few minutes, looking at the house where I'd grown up. It looked the same from the outside, but I knew Patricia had redecorated extensively, erasing my mother's presence and making it her own. I walked to the front door and used the key I'd never returned, the one Patricia probably didn't even know I still had. The house was dark and quiet, but I could sense the tension humming through the walls like electricity. I found Patricia in my mother's study, frantically pulling files from the desk drawers. She looked up when I entered, her face streaked with tears and rage. "You can't do this," she said. "This is our home. This was never your home. You were a guest who overstayed her welcome." She gestured around the room at the expensive furniture and artwork. "What about all of this? We've put our lives into this place. You've put my money into this place. Every piece of furniture you bought, every renovation you made, every dinner party you hosted, was paid for with inheritance you stole from me." I walked to my mother's desk and opened the top drawer, retrieving a small velvet box I'd been looking for. Inside was my grandmother's engagement ring, the one my mother had promised would be mine someday. "That's not yours," Patricia said. "Actually, it is. Everything in this house is mine. The furniture you picked out, the art you hung, the clothes in your closet, all purchased with my money. Patricia sank into the leather chair behind the desk, finally understanding the full scope of her situation. What are you going to do with us? I considered the question. For 18 months, they'd made me feel powerless, insignificant, grateful for whatever scraps they chose to throw my way. They'd systematically erased my place in my own family while building their empire on the foundation of my stolen inheritance. I'm going to do exactly what you did to me, I said finally. I'm going to give you just enough to survive, and then I'm going to watch you struggle for every penny while you remember what it felt like when you had everything. Her face went white. You can't be serious. Dead serious. You'll get a monthly allowance of exactly what you gave me, $1,500. Enough to rent a small apartment and buy groceries, but not enough for the lifestyle you've become accustomed to. That's impossible. We can't live on that. Funny. You seem to think it was perfectly adequate for me. I turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. Oh, and Patricia? The allowance comes with conditions. You'll get it as long as you don't contest the will, don't attempt to contact any family friends or business associates on my behalf, and don't give any interviews to the press about family matters. Break any of those conditions, and the money stops permanently. The next morning, the eviction papers were served at dawn. By noon, the story had broken in the local business press. Pharmaceutical heiress reclaims stolen empire, read the headline in the San Francisco Business Journal. The article detailed the fraudulent board, the unauthorized merger negotiations, and the systematic theft of my inheritance. My phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years, and financial advisors eager to manage my newfound wealth. I ignored most of them, but I did take one call that surprised me. Miss Blackwood? This is James Morrison, from Preston Industries. Preston Industries, the company Marcus had been negotiating with. Mr. Morrison, I assume you've heard about recent developments. I have indeed. I want to assure you that we had no knowledge of Mr. Blackwood's lack of authority. We were operating under the assumption that he was the legitimate heir. I appreciate that. I'm calling because, frankly, we're still very interested in exploring a partnership with Blackwood Pharmaceuticals. Perhaps we could discuss terms that would be mutually beneficial. I almost laughed. Marcus had probably promised to sell them the company for a fraction of its value, desperate to complete a deal that would cement his authority before anyone questioned his legitimacy. What kind of terms were you discussing with Marcus? He was asking for $200 million for the entire company. $200 million. For a company that generated $50 million in annual profit and owned patents worth twice the asking price. Marcus had been planning to sell my inheritance for pennies on the dollar, probably pocketing a substantial portion himself. I see. And what would you be willing to offer the legitimate owner? Well, given the company's actual value and our due diligence findings, we'd be prepared to offer up to $600 million for a full acquisition. $600 million. Marcus had been planning to rob me of $400 million in a single transaction. That's generous, but I'm not interested in selling. Perhaps a partial acquisition? Or a licensing deal for some of your patents? Mr. Morrison, my mother built this company to serve people who couldn't afford medical care. That mission isn't compatible with your business model. I understand. But if you change your mind, our offer stands. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment and calculated exactly how much money Marcus and Patricia had been planning to steal from me. The undervalued sale to Preston Industries would have cost me $400 million. The fraudulent board positions and unauthorized salaries had already cost me several million more. The systematic looting of company resources, the canceled charitable programs, the sale of the research facility all added up to a theft so comprehensive it took my breath away. They hadn't just stolen my money. They'd been planning to destroy everything my mother had built while convincing me I should be grateful for their generosity. That afternoon, I drove to the small apartment Patricia and Marcus had rented across town. It was in a decent neighborhood, but a far cry from the mansion they'd been forced to leave. I knocked on the door and waited. Marcus answered, looking haggard and defeated. He'd aged years in the past week. What do you want, Evelyn? I wanted to see how you were settling in. He stepped aside reluctantly, and I entered the small living room. Patricia was sitting on a second-hand couch, staring blankly at a television that wasn't turned on. The contrast with their former luxury was stark. "Cozy," I observed. "You've made your point," Marcus said. "Was there something specific you wanted?" I pulled a folder from my purse and set it on their coffee table. "I thought you might like to see what you were really planning to steal from me." The folder contained the Preston Industries documentation, along with Sarah's analysis of the company's true value and the charitable programs Marcus had been planning to eliminate. Patricia looked up for the first time since I'd arrived. "What is this?" "It's proof that you weren't just stealing my inheritance. You were planning to destroy my mother's legacy for a fraction of what it was worth." Marcus picked up the papers and scanned them, his face growing paler with each page. $200 million, I continued. "That's what you were going to sell a $600 million company for. Were you planning to pocket the difference? Or were you just that incompetent?" "The negotiations weren't final," Marcus said weakly. "No, but your intentions were clear. You were going to rob me of everything my mother built, eliminate every charitable program she cared about, and sell off the research that could save lives, all so you could cash out quickly." Patricia finally spoke, her voice hollow. "We never meant for it to go that far." "Didn't you? Because the evidence suggests otherwise." I pulled out another document, this one detailing the systematic interception of my mail and phone calls. "You isolated me from my own inheritance for 18 months. You convinced me I was a burden while you lived like royalty on my money. You were planning to sell everything my mother cared about to the highest bidder." "We were trying to preserve the family legacy," Patricia protested. "No. You were trying to convert it into cash you could steal." I stood to leave, then turned back one final time. "You know what the saddest part is? If you'd simply treated me with basic human decency, I probably would have shared everything with you willingly. My mother always said family was more important than money." "Then why are you doing this to us?" Marcus asked. "Because you taught me that she was wrong. You showed me exactly how little family means when money is involved." I left them sitting in their tiny apartment, surrounded by the ruins of their fraudulent empire, and drove back to my own small place across town. But as I unlocked my door, I realized something had changed. This apartment didn't feel like home anymore either. It was time to reclaim everything that was mine. The Blackwood mansion felt different when I walked through its doors as the rightful owner. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed brighter somehow, casting everything in sharp relief. I moved through rooms that had been mine by law for 18 months, but had never felt like home until now. Patricia had left the house in pristine condition, probably hoping that maintaining appearances might somehow earn her mercy. Every surface gleamed, every piece of furniture was perfectly positioned, every decorative object arranged with museum-quality precision. It was beautiful and cold, and utterly devoid of the warmth my mother had cultivated here. I found myself standing in the study where I'd confronted Patricia just days earlier. The walls were lined with books my mother had collected over decades, first editions of medical texts, mixed with classic literature and philosophy. Patricia had never touched them, probably never even noticed them beyond their value as expensive-looking props for her stolen lifestyle. Maria appeared in the doorway, her expression uncertain. She'd worked for the family for 15 years, through my mother's illness and death, through Patricia's reign of renovation, and now through this dramatic reversal of fortune. "Miss Evelyn," she said softly, "I wasn't sure if you'd want me to stay." I turned to face her, this woman who'd shown me more genuine kindness in the past year than my supposed family ever had. "Maria, this is still your home if you want it to be." Relief flooded her features. "Thank you. I was worried that with all the changes." "The only thing that's changing is that the people who belong here are finally in charge again." She nodded, then hesitated. "Miss Patricia, she left some things in the guest room. Personal items. She asked if you might allow her to collect them." I considered this. Patricia had lived in this house for years, had made it her domain in ways that went far beyond mere residence. Allowing her back inside felt like inviting a parasite to return to its host. "Box everything up and have it delivered to her apartment," I said finally. She's not welcome here anymore. Over the next several days, I began the process of reclaiming not just my physical inheritance, but my mother's vision for what it should represent. My first stop was the Blackwood Pharmaceuticals headquarters, where Sarah had arranged for me to meet with the company's senior staff. The conference room was filled with people I barely knew, executives and department heads who'd been excluded from Marcus's inner circle because they'd remained loyal to my mother's principles. As I took my seat at the head of the table, I could see the mixture of hope and skepticism in their faces. They'd watched one illegitimate leader fall. They weren't sure yet whether I would be any different. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "I know the past week has been chaotic, and I want to address that directly." Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the head of research and development, spoke first. "Ms. Blackwood, we're all relieved to see you taking your rightful place, but we need to understand your vision for the company's future. My vision is the same as my mother's was. We exist to develop medicines that save lives, not just to maximize profit margins." Marcus was planning to eliminate the rare disease research program, said Dr. Chen from the financial department. He claimed it was a drain on resources. "The rare disease program stays," I said firmly. "In fact, I want to expand it. How much additional funding would you need to double your current research capacity?" The question caught them off guard. Under Marcus's leadership, every conversation had been about cuts and cost reductions. Now I was talking about expansion. Dr. Harper consulted her notes. "To double our capacity, we'd need approximately $20 million in additional annual funding." Done. What else? For the next 2 hours, we discussed everything Marcus had tried to dismantle. The low-income assistance programs that helped patients afford life-saving medications. The international aid initiatives that provided medicines to developing countries. The scholarship fund for medical students from underserved communities. Every program Marcus had viewed as a wasteful expense, I saw as the heart of our mission. "There's one more thing," Sarah said as the meeting wound down. Marcus had begun preliminary negotiations to license some of our patents to companies that would use them for cosmetic applications rather than medical ones. Quote, "Cosmetic applications. My mother's life-saving research being perverted into vanity products for the wealthy. Cancel all of those negotiations immediately," I said, "and make it clear that Blackwood Pharmaceuticals will never license our medical research for non-medical purposes." As I left the office that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. For so long, I'd defined myself by what I lacked, what I'd been excluded from, what I wasn't allowed to have. Now, suddenly, I had the power to build something meaningful, but I wasn't naive about the challenges ahead. Patricia and Marcus hadn't simply vanished into obscurity. They were out there somewhere, probably planning their next move, looking for ways to undermine my authority or reclaim what they'd lost. The first sign of their continued interference came 3 days later, when Harold Pemberton called with troubling news. "Evelyn, we have a problem," he said without preamble. "Someone has been contacting your mother's former friends and business associates, spreading rumors about your mental health and competency." "What kind of rumors?" "The story goes that you've suffered a complete psychological breakdown following your mother's death. That you're making irrational decisions based on paranoid delusions about your family stealing from you." The strategy was clever in its simplicity. If they couldn't challenge my legal right to the inheritance, they would try to undermine my credibility and competency. Plant enough doubt about my mental state, and they might be able to convince a court that I was unfit to manage my own affairs. Who's spreading these rumors? We're still investigating, but the pattern suggests a coordinated effort. Someone with detailed knowledge of your family dynamics and access to your mother's social circle. Patricia? It had to be. She knew exactly which buttons to push, which people to target, which half-truths would be most damaging. What's our response? We document everything, every conversation, every rumor, every attempt to undermine your competency. And then we destroy them legally. That evening, I received an unexpected visitor. My doorbell rang just after sunset, and when I looked through the peephole, I saw a young woman I didn't immediately recognize. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair and nervous energy that radiated through the door. "Can I help you?" I called out without opening the door. Ms. Blackwood? My name is Jennifer Santos. I work for the San Francisco Chronicle. I was hoping we could talk. A reporter. Exactly what I didn't need right now. I'm not giving interviews, I said. Please, it's about your stepfamily. I think you need to hear what I've discovered. Something in her tone made me reconsider. I opened the door but kept the chain engaged. What kind of discovery? Can I come in? This isn't something I want to discuss in a hallway. Against my better judgment, I let her inside. Jennifer Santos was younger than she'd seemed through the peephole, with the intense focus of someone pursuing a story that consumed her thoughts. I've been investigating financial fraud in estate cases, she began, settling onto my couch. Your situation came to my attention through court filings, but when I started digging deeper, I found something disturbing. She pulled out a tablet and showed me a series of documents. Your stepfamily has done this before. The words hit me like ice water. What do you mean? Patricia's first marriage. Her ex-husband died in a car accident 6 years before she married your father. He was wealthy, owned a chain of successful restaurants. After his death, Patricia inherited everything, but his children from his first marriage were cut out completely. I stared at the screen, reading through legal documents that painted a familiar pattern of manipulation and theft. The circumstances were remarkably similar to your situation. The man's children claimed Patricia had isolated their father from them, manipulated him into changing his will, and stolen their inheritance. But they couldn't prove it in court. What happened to them? The son died in a skiing accident 2 years later. The daughter moved to Europe and hasn't been heard from since. But before she left, she gave a statement to a private investigator detailing exactly how Patricia operated. Jennifer swiped to another document. This one, a typed statement from a woman named Rebecca Morrison. According to Rebecca, Patricia's method was always the same. She'd target wealthy widowers or divorcees, play the role of the devoted companion, gradually isolate them from their existing family, and then manipulate them into changing their wills. When the inheritance came through, anyone who challenged her would face a campaign of character assassination and legal intimidation. My hands trembled as I read Rebecca's statement. It described, in precise detail, the same tactics Patricia had used against me: the systematic isolation, the interception of communications, the gradual erosion of my place in the family structure. Rebecca Morrison wrote this 6 years ago, I said slowly. Yes, she tried to warn other potential victims, but no one believed her. Patricia was too careful, too patient, too skilled at covering her tracks. Why are you showing me this? Jennifer's expression was intense. Because I think you're her first failure, the first time someone had the resources and determination to fight back effectively. I thought about my mother's paranoia in her final months, her secretive meetings with lawyers, her detailed planning for scenarios I'd thought were impossible. She hadn't been paranoid at all. She'd been preparing for war against an enemy she understood better than I'd realized. There's more, Jennifer continued. I've been tracking Patricia's brother Robert as well. He's been involved in similar schemes in 3 different states. Always careful to stay just on the legal side of fraud, but the pattern is unmistakable. A family business. They weren't just opportunistic criminals. They were professional inheritance thieves who'd turned manipulation and theft into a systematic enterprise. What do you want from me? I asked. I want to tell this story. The real story. How they operated, how they were finally stopped, what happened to their other victims. I considered her proposal. Exposing Patricia and her family would certainly destroy any remaining credibility they had, but it would also thrust me into a spotlight I wasn't sure I wanted. If I agree to this, what kind of protection do I have? Full legal review before publication. You'd have final approval over any quotes attributed to you. And my editor has already committed to pursuing this as a multi-part investigative series, which means serious resources for fact-checking and legal protection. I need time to think about it, of course. But Ms. Blackwood, these people have destroyed families. They've stolen millions of dollars from legitimate heirs. If you don't stop them permanently, they'll find other victims. After Jennifer left, I sat in my apartment surrounded by the evidence of my stepfamily's true nature. They weren't just greedy opportunists who'd gotten carried away with my inheritance. They were career criminals who'd perfected their methods over years of practice. The next morning, I called Harold and scheduled an emergency meeting. When I arrived at his office, I brought copies of everything Jennifer had shown me. "This changes everything," Harold said after reviewing the documents. "If we can prove a pattern of inheritance fraud, we're not just talking about civil liability anymore. This becomes a federal crime. What are the implications? Prison time, asset forfeiture, complete destruction of their ability to operate this kind of scheme again. And for me? You become the prosecution's star witness in a case that could prevent dozens of future victims." I thought about Rebecca Morrison, forced to flee the country after Patricia destroyed her father's legacy. About the son who died in a skiing accident before seeing justice. About my mother, who'd spent her final months planning for a war one hadn't even known was coming. Let's do it. The federal investigation moved with surprising speed once Harold made the initial contacts. Within a week, FBI agents were interviewing me, Sarah, Maria, and anyone else who'd witnessed Patricia and Marcus's systematic deception. The agents were particularly interested in the intercepted communications, the fraudulent board appointments, and the planned sale to Preston Industries. Each element added to a growing picture of conspiracy and fraud that extended far beyond simple greed. "The pattern is clear," Agent Rodriguez explained during one of our sessions. "They've been running the same scam for over a decade, always careful to stay just below the threshold that would trigger federal attention. But the scale of what they attempted with your inheritance crossed several lines. How strong is the case? With your mother's documentation and the evidence you've provided, it's airtight. The challenge will be connecting their previous crimes to the current charges." That's where Jennifer Santos's research proved invaluable. Her investigation had uncovered financial records, witness statements, and documentary evidence that tied Patricia and Robert to at least 4 previous inheritance frauds spanning 3 states. "They were careful," Agent Martinez observed, "but not careful enough. When you're running the same scheme repeatedly, patterns emerge." The first arrests came on a Tuesday morning. I was in my office at Blackwood Pharmaceuticals when Sarah knocked on my door with a grim smile. "Turn on the news," she said. I activated the wall-mounted television and found myself watching footage of Patricia being led away from her apartment in handcuffs. The reporter's voice provided commentary over the dramatic visuals. Patricia Blackwood, accused of multiple counts of inheritance fraud and conspiracy, was arrested this morning as part of a federal investigation into organized theft schemes targeting wealthy families across the western United States. The coverage continued with Marcus's arrest outside his gym and Robert's apprehension at the airport, apparently trying to flee to Mexico. Watching them in orange jumpsuits was surreal after months of fearing their power and influence. My phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, distant relatives, and curiosity seekers who'd suddenly discovered my existence. I ignored most of them, but I did take one call that surprised me. "Ms. Blackwood? This is Rebecca Morrison." The woman whose statement had helped expose Patricia's previous crimes was calling from somewhere in Europe, her voice carrying a mixture of vindication and old pain. "I wanted to thank you," she continued. "For 15 years I've lived with the knowledge that my father's killer was walking free, profiting from her crimes. I never thought I'd see justice." "I'm sorry for what you lost," I said. "Don't be sorry, be proud. You did what I couldn't do. You fought back and won." The trial began 6 months later, drawing national attention as details of the inheritance fraud scheme emerged. Jennifer Santos's investigative series had won a Pulitzer Prize, bringing the case into the public consciousness and inspiring other victims to come forward. I testified for 3 days, walking the jury through the systematic manipulation and theft I'd experienced. The most powerful moment came when Harold played the videotape my mother had made while writing her will, her voice clear and determined as she explained exactly why she was taking precautions against Patricia's family. "I've watched them operate," my mother said on the recording. "They're patient, methodical, and completely without conscience. If something happens to me, Evelyn will need protection." The jury took less than 4 hours to return guilty verdicts on all counts. Patricia received 15 years in federal prison. Marcus got 10 years. Robert, as the mastermind of the overall scheme, was sentenced to 20 years. But the real justice came in the aftermath, as their criminal convictions triggered a cascade of civil suits from previous victims. Everything they'd stolen over the years was clawed back and returned to legitimate heirs. The Morrison family trust was restored. 3 other families recovered millions in stolen assets. The day after the sentencing, I drove to my mother's grave for the first time since the funeral. Her headstone was simple granite with her name, dates, and a single line: "She healed the world." "I kept my promise," I said to the stone. "I protected what you built." Standing there in the morning sun, I felt a kind of peace I'd never experienced before. Not just because justice had been served, but because I finally understood what my mother had really left me. Not just money or property or business assets, but the power to continue her work of healing. I returned to the office that afternoon with a clarity of purpose that had been missing during the months of legal battles and investigations. Sarah was waiting with a stack of proposals from the research department, each one representing potential breakthroughs in treating rare diseases. "How many of these can we fund?" I asked. "All of them if you want. We're generating more cash than we can reasonably spend on current operations." "Then let's expand again. I want to create the most advanced rare disease research facility in the world." "That's a massive undertaking. We're talking about hundreds of millions in investment." "Good. My mother always said the best way to honor the dead is to improve the lives of the living." The Elizabeth Blackwood Institute for Rare Disease Research opened 2 years later, employing over 300 scientists and physicians working on conditions that affected fewer than 1 in 10,000 people. It was the kind of project that would never be profitable in traditional terms, but it embodied everything my mother had believed about the responsibility that came with wealth. During the opening ceremony, I found myself thinking about Christmas dinner 3 years earlier, sitting at the children's table while Patricia and Marcus planned my destruction. The memory no longer carried pain. Instead, it reminded me of how completely their world had been built on lies. They'd convinced themselves that inheritance was about deserving, about who was most qualified to manage wealth, about natural hierarchies that put them at the top and me at the bottom. But inheritance, I'd learned, was simpler than that. It was about love and trust, and the belief that the next generation would honor what came before while building something better. My mother had trusted me with her legacy, not because I was the most qualified person to run a pharmaceutical company, but because she believed I would remember why the company existed in the first place. The last piece of justice came in an unexpected form. 6 months after the institute opened, I received a letter from the federal prison where Patricia was serving her sentence. "Evelyn," it began in her familiar handwriting, "I know you have no reason to listen to anything I have to say, but I wanted you to understand that I never intended for things to go as far as they did." The letter continued for 3 pages, a mixture of self-justification and what might have been genuine remorse. She claimed that she'd initially planned to treat me fairly, that the manipulation had escalated gradually, that she'd convinced herself I was happier without the burden of real responsibility. "I know you'll never forgive me," she concluded, "but I hope someday you'll understand that not everything we did came from malice. Some of it came from a genuine belief that we were protecting you from a world you weren't prepared for." I read the letter twice, then filed it away without responding. Patricia was still trying to control the narrative, still attempting to minimize her crimes by claiming noble motives. Some people, I'd realized, were simply incapable of accepting responsibility for the damage they'd caused. But her letter did remind me of something important. The story of what had happened to our family would be told and retold for years, probably becoming a cautionary tale about greed and manipulation. It was crucial that the real truth be preserved, not Patricia's revisionist version. So I sat down and wrote my own account, detailing everything from my mother's suspicious final months to the moment Patricia was led away in handcuffs. It became a book, published by a university press and donated to legal libraries as a resource for attorneys dealing with inheritance fraud cases. The book's final chapter was titled "Building Forward," and it focused not on the destruction of my enemies but on the construction of something worthy of my mother's memory. The Institute had begun producing breakthroughs in treatments for diseases that had never received adequate research funding. Children who would have died were living. Families who would have faced impossible medical bills were getting help. That, ultimately, was the victory that mattered. Not the prison sentences or the recovered assets or the public vindication, but the lives being saved by resources that had almost been stolen and squandered. 5 years after that Christmas dinner, I hosted my own holiday celebration at the mansion. The guest list included researchers from the Institute, families who'd been helped by our patient assistance programs, and the small group of friends I'd maintained through everything. Maria prepared the meal with the same care she'd always shown, but this time the guest of honor was Dr. Sarah Chen, who'd just been named to head the Institute's new international division. The conversation around my table focused on scientific breakthroughs and humanitarian missions, not stock prices and merger opportunities. As we sat down to eat, I looked around the table at faces filled with purpose and passion, people who'd dedicated their lives to healing and helping others. This was what a family dinner should feel like, not a performance of wealth and status, but a gathering of people united by shared values and genuine affection. After dinner, as my guests mingled in the living room, I stepped outside onto the terrace. The San Francisco skyline glittered in the distance, lights marking the homes and offices of millions of people living their own complicated stories of love and loss, triumph and betrayal. Somewhere out there, Patricia was spending her 7th year in federal prison, probably still convinced that she'd been treated unfairly. Marcus had been released after serving 6 years, but his criminal record had made him essentially unemployable in any position of responsibility. Robert had died in prison 2 years earlier, taking his secrets and schemes with him. They'd gambled everything on a con that had worked for them before, never imagining they'd finally targeted someone who refused to be a victim. Their downfall had been as complete as their arrogance had been boundless. But standing on that terrace, looking out at the city my mother had loved, I realized that their fate had stopped mattering to me years ago. They'd been obstacles to overcome, problems to solve, not the central figures in my story. The central figure was my mother, whose love and planning had made everything possible. The central figure was the work itself, the daily effort to honor her memory by continuing her mission of healing. The central figure was the future, bright with possibilities I was only beginning to imagine. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Santos, who'd become a friend over the years of investigation and trial coverage. "Watching your speech at the medical conference," she wrote. "Your mother would be so proud." I smiled and typed back. She already knew. That's why she trusted me with all of this. And that, I realized, was the deepest truth of the whole story. My mother hadn't left me an inheritance to manage. She'd left me a mission to complete, trusting that I would find the strength to be worthy of her faith. Standing there under the stars, surrounded by the sounds of friends and colleagues celebrating another year of healing work accomplished and challenges overcome, I finally understood what she'd really given me. Not money, not property, not even justice, though that had been satisfying in its own way. She'd given me the chance to become the person she'd always believed I could be, the person I'd finally learned I actually was. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.